The governor of the province of Juan de Pacalamos assured Humboldt that letters carried by this singular water post were rarely ever wedded or lost. Soon after his return to Europe from Mexico, the traveler received in Paris travelers' letters from Tomepeda, which had been sent in the manner above described. Several tribes of Indians living on the banks of the upper Amazon made their journey in a similar manner, swimming down the stream sociably in parties. On approaching the hot climate of the basin of the Amazons, the eyes of the travelers were cheered by the aspect of a beautiful and occasionally luxuriant vegetation. They had never before, not even the Canaries or on the hot sea coast of Cumana and Caracas, seen finer orange trees than those of the Huetes de Puraca, laden with many thousands of golden fruits. They attained a height of 60 feet, and instead of rounded tops, had aspiring branches, almost like laurels or bay trees. The oranges of these trees were deliciously sweet, through the bitter or Seville orange was not waiting among them. Not far from thence, near the ford of Cavico, the travelers were surprised by an unexpected sight. They saw a grove of small trees, only about 18 or 19 feet high, which were, instead of green, had apparently red or rose-colored leaves. It was a new species of Bougainvillea, a genus first established by the elder Jussieu from a Brazilian specimen in Commerson's herbarium. The trees were almost entirely without true leaves, as what was taken for leaves at a distance proved to be thickly crowded bacteria. The appearance was altogether different. The purity and freshness of the color from the autumnal tints which in many of our forest trees adorn the woods of the temperate zone at the season of fall of the leaf. They found at Chemaya rafts in readiness to convey them to Tomapida, which they desired for the purpose of determining the difference of longitude between Quito and the mouth of the Chipe. They slept as usual under the open sky on the sandy shore at the confluence of the Rio de Chamaya with the Amazons. The next day they embarked on the narrow river and descended it to the cataracts and the narrows of Rentema, where rocks of coarse-grained sandstone rose like towers and formed a rocky dam across the river. Humboldt measured a baseline on the flat and sandy shore and found that at Tomapia, the afterwards mighty river of the Amazons, was only a little above 1,386 feet across, and the celebrated river Nero of Mansiate, between Santiago and San Borja, in a mountain ravine where at some points the overhanging rocks and canopy of foliage forbade more than a feeble light to penetrate, and where all the driftwood, consisting of a countless number of trunks of trees, was broken and dashed in pieces. The breadth of the stream was less than 160 feet. The rocks by which all these narrows were formed underwent many changes in the course of centuries. Thus, a part of the rocks forming the narrow of Rentema had been broken up by a high flood a year before Humboldt's journey, and there had been preserved among the inhibitions by traditions a lively recollection of the precipitous fall of the then towering mass of rock along the whole of the Narrow, an event which took place in the early part of the 18th century. This fall and the consequent blocking up the channel arrested the flow of the stream, and the inhabitants of the village of Puaya situated below the narrow of Rentema, saw with alarm the wide city bed entirely dry. But after a few hours, the waters forced their way. Earthquakes movements were not supposed to have occasioned this remarkable occurrence. The powerful stream appeared to be incessantly engaged in improving its bed, with some idea of the force which it exerted may be formed from the circumstance that, notwithstanding its breadth, it was sometimes so swollen as to rise more than 26 feet in the course of 20 or 30 hours. The travelers remained for 17 days in the hot valley of the upper Amazons. Here Humboldt corrected and revised the chart of the Amazon made by Condamine by sketching an accurate chart of this unknown portion of the great river, partly from his own observations and partly from the careful inquiries. This done, they ascended the eastern declivity of the Cordilleras and arrived at their argentiferous mountain of Guatalac, the principal site of the silver mines of Guatalac. Was an insulated mass of siliceous rock, traversed by the multitudes of veins of silver which often intersected and terminating to the north and west by a deep and almost perpendicular precipice. The outline of the mountain was broken by numerous tower-like and pyramidal points. "Our mountain," said a rich possessor of mines to the travelers, "stands there like an enchanted castle." Guadalac reminded Humboldt of the serrated crest of the Montserrat Mountains in Guatemala, which he had visited before his departure for the New World. Besides being perforated to his summit by many hundred galleries, driven in every direction, this mountain presented natural openings in the mass of the siliceous rock, though which the intensely dark blue sky of the elevated regions was visible to a spectacular standing at the foot of the mountain. These openings were called windows, the windows of Guadalac. Similar windows were pointed out to the travelers in the halls of the volcanoes of Pinchicha, and called by a similar name, the windows of Pinchicha. The strangeness of the view was still further increased by the numerous small sheds and dwelling houses, which nestled on the side of the fortress-like mountain, wherever a flat surface permeated their erection. The miners carried down the ore in baskets by very steep and dangerous paths to the places where the process of amalgamation was performed. The travelers quartered themselves a while near the mines in the small mountain town of Mississippi, which was 12,000 feet above the level of the sea, and where only 6 degrees 43 from the equator, water froze in the house nightly throughout a large portion of the year. In this desert devoid of vegetation lived 3,000 or 4,000 persons, who were obliged to have all their means of subsistence brought from the warm valleys, as they themselves only reared some kinds of kale and salad. Here, as in every town in the high mountains of Peru, and we had the richer class of persons to pass their time in gambling. They reminded Humboldt of the soldier of Pizarro's troop, who, after the pillage of the temple at Cusco, complained that he had lost in one night at play a great piece of the sun. In a high plain not far from Mississippi, there were found throughout an area of above a square mile, immediately under the turf, as it were intertwined with the roots of the alpine grasses, enormous masses of rich red silver ore, and threads of pure silver. Another elevated plain near the Quebrada de Cucura was called the Field of Shells. The name referred to the fossils which belonged to the Cretaceous group, and which were formed there in such abundance that they early attracted the attention of the natives. In this place, there was obtained near the surface a mass of pure gold, spun round with threads of silver in the richest manner. The path by which the travelers journeyed from Municipapa to Caxamarca was difficult even for mules. Their way lay over a succession of paramos, where they were exposed almost incessantly to the fury of the wind, and to the sharp-edged hail so peculiar to the ridges of the Andes. The height of the route above the level of the sea was generally between 9,000 and 10,000 feet. Reaching at length the last of these mountains wildernesses, they looked down with increased pleasure on the fertile valley of Caxamarca. It afforded a charming prospect. A small river wound through the elevated plain, which was of an oval form and about 100 square miles in extent. The plain resembled that of the Bocata. Both were probably the bottoms of ancient lakes, but at Caxamarca there was wanting the myth of the wonder-working Bochita, who opened for the waters a passage through the rock of Tequendama. Caxamarca was situated 640 feet higher than Bogota, almost as high as the city of Quito. But being sheltered by surrounding mountains, it enjoyed a far more milder and more agreeable climate. The soil was extremely fertile, and the plain full of cultivated fields and gardens traversed by avenues of willows, large flowered red, white, and yellow varieties of datura, mimosas, and beautiful guitar trees. Wheat yielded on an average in the Pampa de Caxamarca 15 to 20-fold, but the hopes of a plentiful harvest were sometimes disappointed by night frosts, occasioned by the great radiation of heat towards the unclouded sky through the dry and rarefied mountain air. These frosts were not felt in the roofed houses. In the northern part of the plain, small polyorific domes broke through the widely extended sandstone strata, and probably once formed islands in the ancient lake before its waters had flowed off. On the summit of one of these domes, the Cerro de Santa Paulina, the travelers enjoyed a beautiful prospect. The ancient residence of Antahulapa was surrounded on this side by fruit gardens and by irrigated fields of lucerne. Columns of smoke were seen as its distance from the warm baths of Altamaraca, which were still called the baths of the Inca. Antahulapa spent a year of the at the baths, where some slight remains of his palace still survived the devastating range of the conquistadors. A large and deep basin in which, according to tradition, one of the golden chairs in which the Inca had carried had been sunk, and has ever since been sought in vain, appeared to Humboldt from the regularity of its circular shape to have been artificially excavated in the rocks above one of the fissures through which the springs issued. Of the fort and palace of Atahualpa, there were only very slight remains in the town, which were adorned with some fine churches. The destruction of the ancient gold buildings were hastened by the devouring thirst of gold, which led men before the close of the 16th century, in digging for supposed hidden treasures, to overturn walls and careless laid to undermine or weaken the foundations of all the houses. The palace of the Inca was situated on the hill of Porphyry, which had originally been hollowed out at the surface, so it had been surrounded by the principal dwelling almost like a wall or rampart. A state prison or municipal building had been erected on a part of the ruins. The most considerable ruins were visible, but which were only from 13 to 16 feet high, were opposite the continent of San Francisco. They consisted of fine-cut blocks of stone 2 or 3 feet long and placed upon each other without cement, as in the fortress of Canar. There was a shaft sunk in the polyorific rock which once led into the subterranean chambers, and a gallery said to extend to the other polyorific dome before spoken of. Such arrangements showed an apprehension of the uncertainties of war and the desire to secure the means of escape. The burying of treasures was an old and very generally prevailing Peruvian custom. Subterranean chambers were often found below many of the private dwellings of Caxamarca. The travelers were shown steps cut into the rock, and also what was called the Inca's foot bath. The washing of the monarch's feet was accompanied by some inconvenient usages of court etiquette. Minor buildings designed according to the tradition of the servants were constructed partly like the others of cut stone and provided with sloped roofs and partly with well-formed bricks, alternating with salacious cement. In the latter class of constructions, there were vaulted recesses, the antiquity of which Humboldt long doubted, but as he afterwards believed without sufficient grounds. In the principal building, the room was still shown in which the unhappy Atahualpa was kept prisoner for 9 months from November 1532, and there was pointed out to the wall on which the captives signified to what height he would fill a room with gold, if set free. This height is given variously by Xerez in his Conquista del Peru, which Garcia has preserved for us, by Hernando Pizarro in his letters, and by which the other writers of this period, the prince said that gold in bars, plates, and vessels should be heaped up as high as he could reach with his hand. Xerez assigns to the room a length of 23 feet and a breadth of 18 feet. Garcilaso de la Vega, who quitted Peru in his 20th year in 1560, estimates the value of the treasures collected from the temples of the sun at Cusco, Huanas, Humaco, and Pechameca up to the fateful 29th of August 1553, on which day the Inca was put to death at 3,838,000 ducados de oro, not far from the 15 millions of dollars. In the chapel of the state prison, the stone was still marked by the indelible stains of blood. It was a thin slab, 13 feet long, placed in front of the altar, and had probably been taken from the porphyry or trachyte of the vicinity. Humboldt was not permitted to make a precise examination by striking off a part of the stone, but the 3 or 4 supposed bloodstone spots appeared to him to be natural collections of hornblende or peroxide in the rock. The Lycete Fernando Montesinos, who visited Peru scarcely 100 years after taking of Caxamarca, even at the early period, gave currency to the fable that Atahualpa was beheaded in prison, and that stains of blood were still visible on the stone on which the execution had taken place. There is no reason, however, to doubt the fact confirmed by many eyewitnesses that the Inca, to avoid being burnt alive, consented to be baptized under the name Juan de Hantalupa by his fanatic persecutor, the Dominican monk Vincente de Valverde. He was put to death by strangulation publicly and in the open air. Another tradition relates that a chapel was raised over the spot where Antelupe was garroted, and his body rests beneath the stone. In such case, the supposed spots of blood remain entirely unaccounted for. In reality, however, the corpse was never placed beneath the stone in question. After a mass for the dead and solemn funeral rites at which the brothers Pizarro were present in mourning habits, it was conveyed first to the churchyard of the convent of San Francisco, and afterwards to Quito, Antelupe's birthplace. This last transfer was in compliance with the expressed wish of the dying Inca. His personal enemy, the astute Romanov, political motives caused the body to be buried at Quito with solemn obsequies. Humboldt found descendants of the monarch, the family of the Incan cacique Atahualpa, dwelling in Caxamarca, among the melancholy ruins of ancient departed splendor and living in great poverty and preservation, patient and uncomplaining. The son of Cacique Astropilico, a pleasing and friendly youth of 17 who accompanied Humboldt over the ruins of the place of his ancestor. While living in extreme poverty, had filled his imagination with images of buried splendor and golden treasures hidden beneath the masses of rubbish upon which they trod. He related to the traveler that one of his more immediate forebears had bound his wife's eyes and then conducted her through many labyrinths cut in the rock and to the subterranean garden of the Incas. There she saw, skillfully and elaborately imitated and formed of the purest gold, artificial trees, with leaves and fruits and birds sitting on the branches. And there too was the much sought for golden traveling chair of Antelupe. The man commanded his wife not to touch any of these enchanted riches because the long foretold period of the restoration of the empire had not yet arrived, and that whoever should attempt before that time to appropriate any of them would die that very night. These golden dreams and fancies of the youth were founded on recollections and traditions of former days. These artificial golden gardens were often described by the actual eyewitnesses Cizia de Leon, Sarmiento, Garcileco, and other of his historians of the conquest. They were found beneath the Temple of the Sun at Cusco in Caxamarca, and in the pleasant valley of Yucay, a favorite residence of the monarch's family. Where the golden gardens were not below ground, living plants grew by the side of the artificial ones. Among the latter, tall plants and ears of maize were mentioned as particularly well executed.